Go. All right, it's working. So this afternoon, we have split the presentation between two members who were so kind as to present so much material for show and tell last November that we figured we could make a half a program out of the excess material for today. Before we start on that, I will put in a brief commercial for the next two, which are March 26th, Clemens Albert, who sits in Germany, is going to talk about the postal use of the 1938 New Hebrides Gold Franc issue. And on April 23rd, Loic Dufresne, who is with us today, is talking about Beyond the Stamps, a journey into the group type metaverse. And we have open dates after that. I will tell you that through an unlikely series of events, I had a person who lives in Manhattan, New York City, email me and ask about what to do with 28 cartons of French material left over from a collector who was active in the mid-50s through the early 80s. When he died, he left it to a woman who was a tenant in a building that he owned. And when she died, she left it to this gentleman who's had it in storage for probably, I don't know, I don't know that the woman ever looked at it. He never looked at it. So this stuff has not been seen for about 40 years.
Wow.
Well, there's a mishmash of stuff, as with most of us. He was an eclectic collector, but his principal collection is the 10-cent sewer, Scott 162. And he starts with an essay, actually two essays, followed by a progressive essay proof on a sheet with four images. And then behind that, he's got 46 more pages of 10-cent sewer material, coils, booklets, memo, surcharges, Silesia, and so on, you name it. So I'm hopeful that, it's now sitting behind me, and you can see some cartons sitting right there. It's in one of those cartons or sitting on top. And I'm hopeful that I can produce a Zoom presentation, a PowerPoint and Zoom presentation out of that material and put it on for our group sometime this summer. So that's the future. And I encourage anybody who's interested to step forward and make a presentation at the end of May or June or any time after that, except December, which we will again skip because of all the holidays that occur in December. So this afternoon, Tom Mara is going to talk to us first about Vichy postal history, because as most of us know, the Vichy stamps were of kind of questioned validity, shall we say, right? And so I'm going to share my screen. And I want it to be that one. How's that? Everybody see a snowy day there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Good. All righty. Tom?
I'm here. Yeah. Everybody
Take it
can hear
away.
me? I'm being heard?
Yeah.
Yes, you
Yes.
Very good. And first of all, kudos to Ken for the excellent PowerPoint presentation that he created in the last few days. The material is basically from my article that I published in the Philatelist in January on the distribution and postal history of the Vichy issues that were in circulation in French West Africa. And I have a selection of covers, some of which are philatelic, but others appear to be actually legitimately used commercial mail. And I will review this topic. starting with the background. Of course, the occupation of France, which began in June 1940 and continued to the liberation of Paris in August 1944. And Vichy was the administration in the southern 40% of France, whereas the Germans occupied the northern 60%, including the Atlantic Wall that they wanted to protect from an Allied invasion, which subsequently came D-Day 1944, although the British tried a little bit earlier than that at Dieppe, and that was a failure in 1942. The Vichy government issued stamps for the French colonies from Paris, from the Agence Comptable des Postes Coloniaux in Paris, and the vast majority of these stamps were never received in the colonies because of wartime conditions. So we'll briefly look at some of those stamps and discuss them, as well as go through a series of covers, both philatelic and non-philatelic, used during the war, and also some philatelic curiosities after the war. They don't necessarily have any postal history value, but are still of some interest because of the way they were processed by the local post offices in French West Africa. There are some references at the end, and those same references can be seen in my article published in the Philatelist. Again, this is a review for our members who are quite familiar with what happened to France during the war. The Third Republic ended with the occupation and the establishment of the Vichy regime. It was no longer République Française, it was État Français under Philippe Pétain, the hero of the Battle of Verdun, who became the figurehead president of France, although the real leader of the Vichy regime after 1942 was Laval. But Pétain remained the figurehead, and he appeared on many stamps in both France and the colonies during the war. The credo of France was no longer liberté, égalité, fraternité, but more the fascist travail, famille, and patrie, country, family, and work. Vichy was an autocratic single-party regime that tried to establish a similar autocracy in the French colonies that remained loyal to Vichy, although very quickly a number of colonies were taken over by the Free French of de Gaulle, who initially established his headquarters in London in June 1940. But as we heard from Jim Taylor earlier last year about Félix Éboué, the governor of Chad, he got French Equatorial Africa on the map as a free French colony. And de Gaulle then established his initial headquarters after London in Brazzaville. Indochina had a rather different Vichy experience. They had a very strongly pro-Vichy government that collaborated with Japan, and actually the civil administration was left to the French, and Japan did not totally occupy French Indochina until March 1945, 7 months after the liberation of France from the Germans. Again, as mentioned, the stamps for the colonies were produced by the Agence Comptable des Postes Coloniaux in Paris. Most of them never reached the colonies. So the catalog seemed to be very ambivalent about how to list the Vichy stamps in the catalog, particularly the Scott catalog. Although they mentioned them, there was no pricing except for the Defense of the Empire issue of 1941, which was never released in any of the colonies, but Scott did price these in unused condition for some of the West African colonies. But they were never used there, and they never were in circulation. And any letters containing these stamps are merely contrived philatelic curiosities produced by collectors and accepted by local ignorant postmasters who did not know the stamps were not valid. The occupation, basically, there was a major change in the situation in France in November 1942 with the Operation Torch, when the Allies launched their invasion of French Morocco and Algeria under the direction of Eisenhower, who was the overall commander. And at that point, November 8th, 1942, the politics were rather interesting. At that time, the Germans, of course, were very concerned about an invasion of southern France, so they occupied the entire country of France by November 11th, 1942, and that completely severed any mail connections back and forth between France and any of the colonies after November 11th, 1942. Here's a map that actually shows what we're talking about. Occupied France, with the southern 40% being the Vichy regime. And as I said, the only colonies that really received Vichy issues from 1940 to 43, basically, were those colonies that were closest to France, French North Africa and French West Africa. Of course, by September 1940, French Equatorial Africa was already under the control of the Free French. They had to invade Gabon to add that to French Equatorial Africa, as they maintained a Vichy regime for several months. The British occupied Madagascar in late 1942. There was a blockade of the Somali coast that eventually came under Free French control in late 1942 as well. The more far-flung colonies in the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific quickly joined the Free French movement, except for Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Guyana, which did not become Free French until March to July 1943, rather late. The U.S. Was rather concerned about Free French control of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, fearing that if the Free French took control, it might inspire the Germans to take over the island in order to control a radio transmission tower that could give information to submarines German submarines patrolling the North Atlantic. This is an interesting graph or table that is obtained from another website, the Military Postal History Society produced a talk on the same subject, Vichy stamps in the French colonies. And this lists all the colonies in the first column and when they transitioned from the Third Republic to the Free French. And when they were under control by Vichy, when the stamps were issued and for which colonies, which is the B1 column. B2 is where the Vichy issues were actually used. I won't go over that entire list, but I can safely say it was all of the West African colonies and Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco that had use of Vichy stamps. There was a period of time. I always thought that after the Torch invasion, when North Africa and West Africa came under the control of the Allies, my assumption was that they immediately were Free French and under the control of de Gaulle, but that was not at all the case. As it turned out, FDR did not want to work with de Gaulle. He thought he was an autocrat and an imperialist and a future French dictator. He preferred to cut a deal with Darlan, who was visiting Algeria at the time, visiting his son, who was in hospital suffering from a case of polio. Darlan was actually a hired government official in Vichy, but at the time of the invasion was in Algeria visiting his son. And the Allies, Eisenhower, FDR, decided to negotiate directly with Darlan to obtain a ceasefire from the Vichy forces stationed in North Africa, which was accomplished, and it made the invasion a lot easier for the Allies. But FDR was vilified in the American press after this for negotiating with a Nazi and a collaborator. The British also did not like Darlan. Churchill preferred to work with de Gaulle, who had his initial office in London. And what interestingly happened is after Darlan became the chief administrator on November 11th, 1942, after the successful Torch invasion, Darlan was in charge of basically the French forces in North Africa and West Africa. But on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1942, he was assassinated, supposedly by a monarchist who was unhappy and wanted a restoration of the monarchy in France. That was the story. But as it turns out, there was probably some British SOE involvement in the assassination. Clearly, Churchill was not happy with Darlan, as were many of the Allies. So after that, it became a question who is in charge. General Giraud, who also came via Vichy France, but was hiding out in Gibraltar before the invasion, the Torch invasion, or with de Gaulle or Giraud, who would be in charge? Well, again, FDR did not like de Gaulle, and so he chose to deal with Giraud, and he became the administrative leader of French North Africa and the West African colonies by November 11th night. Well, actually by December 25th, 1942, after the assassination of Darlan. And he remained the leader until he was forced to resign in November 1943, at which time then finally de Gaulle and the Free French were in charge. Giraud was a rather interesting character. He clearly had some pro-Vichy and pro-Pétain sentiments, and he insisted while he was in charge in West Africa and North Africa that Pétain's portrait remain on the walls of government buildings. Rather interesting sidelight. He also had some anti-Semitic policies that he kept in place in Algeria until the spring of 1943. And because of his political status, he quickly lost favor with the Allies and was forced to resign, as I said, in late 1943. Now, the Vichy stamps were issued for the colonies between 1941 and 1944. Here you see the Pétain issue for Côte d'Ivoire and Cameroon. These were issued in November 1941 for all 24 colonies, and the mandates, total of 48 stamps. In 1944, they were overprinted of Colonial, semi-postal overprint that came out in 1944. Those were never received in the colonies. But again, the 1941 issue was in circulation in French West Africa beginning in November 1941. Oddly, Senegal never received the set, and it's questionable whether Togo did. But the other colonies of French West Africa did receive the basic 1941 Pétain set. Also in 1941, as I mentioned, the Defense of the Empire 3-value semi-postal issue came out. Rather attractive set, I think. I think trying to demonstrate that the Vichy colonies would resist any attempt at invasion by either the Allies or the Axis, which was rather interesting. It's military stamps that are, I think, rather attractive. They were never released in the colonies, sold only in Paris. In 1942, June, the PEIQI issue came out. That is the protection of native children and imperial fortnight. You don't see the blue imperial fortnight stamp here, just the native children protection ones, but you will see some on cover later in the presentation. This set actually was released in all of the French West African colonies beginning in September 1942. 82,500 sets were prepared in Paris, and 10,000 were released in French West Africa. So they were in circulation, they were in use beginning in September 1942, supposedly exhausted by the end of the year. As I mentioned, the Scott catalog had a lot of trouble knowing what to do with the Vichy stamps, and it was only in 2004, 60 years after the liberation of France, that the Scott catalog finally decided to list and price all of the Vichy issues, adding 344 new entries to the catalog. Additionally, the Vichy regime issued a number of Third Republic colonial stamps without the RF insignia. So they were the San RF stamps, including for West Africa, an airmail series of 8 stamps for each of the 8 colonies of West Africa. And there was the high value for that set was a 50 franc stamp. Senegal also was issued a 100 franc stamp. Now, there's good evidence that both the 50 franc stamp of the colonies and the 100 franc stamp of Senegal were in circulation in West Africa and were legitimately used, although they're not priced in used condition or on cover in the Delay Maury catalog, even to this day. Although I have to say my last catalog was 2006. So I don't know if there was any change after 2006, but there was some concern whether these airmail stamps, including the 50 franc, was actually used. The lower value stamps of the set, which would be in the Scott catalog C6 to C12, were never released in the colonies, not legitimately used, only sold in Paris. Now, Edmond Curoy, famous French colony stamp dealer in New York, who was one of the founding members of this society, published an article in the Philatelist in 1962, very accurately identifying which Vichy stamps were used in the colonies. But regarding the 50 franc airmail stamp of 1942, he stated that it was not placed in use until late 1945, serving the need for a high-value airmail stamp, but only placed in use long after the liberation of France, when postal communications could have been resumed. Well, this information is incorrect. I will demonstrate two letters, one in my collection and one I found in the British France and Colonies Society publication, that show two covers where from March 1944, long before the liberation, and a second one from January 1945 from Dakar, or not, from Côte d'Ivoire to French Morocco, Casablanca. So they were issued long before Curoy's late 1945 timeline. But generally, his review was quite accurate in terms of where the stamps were used, which colonies received them, the distribution, and when they were nullified for use. And that was way back in 1962. But by the early 80s, additional articles were published in Colfra and summarized by Bob Stone in a Philatelist article in 1982, which really solidified what we know about the distribution and use of the Vichy stamps in the colonies. Then the covers. This is one I showed last time. Interesting cover. It's totally philatelic, never went through the mail. It was created by the purser of the Georges Leg cruiser, a Vichy French cruiser that was stationed at harbor in Dakar in January 1942. The hexagonal cancel says 41, but the purser had not yet updated the year date to 42, since it was early in the year and there probably wasn't much mail coming out of the ship. So he wasn't up to date with 1942 yet. The cover was supposed to be sent to a sailor in Fort-de-France, Martinique, but it never went through the mail. There's no receiver mark from Martinique on the back. But what this cover shows is that the sailors on board the ship were able to purchase the Pétain issue in the local Dakar post office, where all of these stamps from all the colonies, except for oddly Senegal, which didn't get them, and probably Togo. So the sailors could purchase the stamps and paste up some philatelic covers and get them canceled by the purser. The Georges Leg has a rather interesting military history. It was involved in the defense of Dakar in September 1940, fending off an attack by the British and Free French, which failed to capture Dakar and French West Africa. which remained under Vichy control, as I said, until November 1942. This is a similar cover, which supposedly was postage due in an article from Robert Stone going back to the 1970s. So there was more than one of these covers. I've even seen one that had no addressee at all. So they're purely philatelic, but the stamps were available in the Dakar post office in 1942. Here's one from Sudan. This would be the appropriate airmail rate of 3 francs 50 for an FM military free franc cover, supposedly to Marseille, but again, there's no Marseille receiver, and the cover was not sealed, so I think it was favor canceled in Bamako. But the very blurry, illegible cancel is rather typical of what I have seen from Bamako on other legitimate covers from the period. So it's possible this actually did go through the mail. I can't be sure about that. There's no receiver on the back. This is a recently acquired one that did go through the mail in Ivory Coast. It was posted on December 23rd, 1942 in Sassandra and was sent to Abidjan. And you can see the back stamp from Abidjan on 31st of December, 1942. This was posted the day before Darlan was assassinated. And by the time it arrived in Abidjan, Giraud was in charge of West Africa, in charge of the administration there. Any of the covers that actually went through the mail, of course, have greater value than philatelically derived covers that were just favor canceled in the post office. This is one that is from French Guinea, Conakry, that shows actual commercial use of a pétain, along with additional Guinea stamps to make the 1 franc 50 surface rate for France and colonies at the time. It did receive a slogan cancel, "Un seul but, la victoire," 1 goal alone, victory. And this was the Allied victory they were working for now, even though pétain was still on the stamps in 1943. This is a rather interesting one, again from Conakry, Guinea. It's a Naval Postal Bureau number 71 cover, which actually is a post office in the port, naval post office in the port of Conakry that opened in April 1943 and was closed at the end of October 1945. A little over 2 years in service was Naval Bureau number 71. It's obviously a philatelic cover, and it appears that stamps from Algeria could be used in French Guinea. Presumably, there was no restriction on the use of French or French colonial stamps in naval bureaus. This would be similar to French ship mail, which could use either colonial or French stamps. But this is the pétain stamp from Algeria, a block of 15, and it has the same "Un seul but, la victoire" arrival flamme publicitaire, or a slogan cancel on the back from the Conakry post office the day after it was processed in the Naval Bureau. Then we have the interzone postcards, which are rather scarce from French West Africa, much more common when they're used from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. These were cards that were used for mail to the occupied portion of France. This one went from Dakar to Corol in La Manche province, which was definitely occupied France, northern France. The blue hand stamp is the airmail surtax for the card. There was both an 80 centime and a 1 franc 20 interzone card that was available for use in West Africa and North Africa. Postage stamps were not acceptable. And the reason for that is that the Germans were afraid that hidden messages might be written on the back of stamps. So only postal stationery could be used. Here's an irregular use in Dakar of a French pétan stamp from August 1941, in addition to colonial stamps to make up the 1 franc 50 basic surface mail rate to Marseille. Again, there's no receiver mark from Marseille on the back, but it does look pretty commercial. And it appears the most postmaster initially did not accept the pétan stamp for prepayment, and he stamped T and triangle for postage due, and then crossed it out, thinking, well, maybe he didn't care, maybe he was, and this was 1942, he was thinking that maybe the Vichy days were whatever. We don't know what his thoughts were. We can only conjecture, but he did accept the pétan stamp for postage. French stamps, of course, were not authorized for use in the colonies. This is another pétan issue from the small town of Acajut, Mauritania, sent to Saint Louis, Senegal, 1943, March. This is the airmail rate, 3 franc 50. It looks like an FM cover, but there's no FM marking or military endorsement. So it's a bit curious. It could just be favor canceled and philatelic. Now here's the PEI-QI issue, and you can see now the blue fortnight stamp, imperial fortnight stamp in the right corner, along with the protection of native children stamps used in Bogué, Mauritania, and sent to Saint Louis, Senegal. Now, this one did go through the mail. It was received in Saint Louis on November 17th, 2 days after it was posted in Bogué, which is quite close to the border with Senegal. This was originally purchased from Edmund Curoy in the mid-1970s as he was winding down his New York stamp business at a very attractive price at the time, but that was the mid-1970s. And of course, Curoy had the contacts during World War II with the colonies that he could produce some very interesting items, as many of you are probably aware of some of the Curoy inspired covers from World War II. This is a cover that I pulled from a very interesting French website called Histoire et Philatelic, which has a lot of very interesting material about World War II and French and French colonial philately. And this actually shows regular FM military mail sent from Dakar to unoccupied France in 1942, October 1942, and it shows an under-franked cover. The rate should have been 3 francs 50, but it has only a 2 franc PEI-QI stamp So it's double taxed at 3 francs on arrival in France with the T in triangle for postage due. This would be a very rare item, this one. Not from my collection. You can see État Français, the circular red stripe for the French state, meaning it was Vichy France. Now talking about the 50 franc airmail that supposedly wasn't released until late 1945. This is my cover from Sassandra, Côte d'Ivoire to Casablanca from January 1945, much earlier than Kilroy's timeline of late 45. It's definitely a commercial cover that's censored with free French censored tape and markings. Interesting cover. This is the one from the British France and Colonies Society that appeared in their recent periodical. Very interesting cover from March 1944 and well before the liberation of Paris. This was sent to Geneva, Red Cross mail. It has a German censorship tape at the bottom right, and you can see 5 50 franc Dahomey airmail stamps that, according to the delay, does not exist in used condition or on cover, but it does. And this is probably a pretty rare cover. Not many of those stamps were actually legitimately used, but sometimes they were not legitimately used. And this is a post-war philatelic cover to a New York stamp dealer. The 50 franc, this is the entire C6 to C13 Mauritania set. And of course, the 50 franc stamp was valid for use and would have certainly paid the airmail and registration fee. But the other stamps were never released or legitimately used in French West Africa, but they received favor cancels in the post office. Sometimes there was less success getting the Vichy stamps used. This is another post-war philatelic curiosity, a cover sent to a collector probably in Colorado with a Ivory Coast Railroad post office cancel. And you can see the sender wanted to sneak in a couple of Vichy airmail stamps, but the postmaster, rather astute he was, recognized that these were not allowed, the Vichy stamps. So he circled it in a red crayon and marked it 3 francs postage due, double taxation. The original documents from French West Africa were reviewed in some of these earlier articles from the early 1980s in COFRA. And there were 2 major articles or documents from 1945 and 1952 that basically confirmed where the Vichy stamps were used and when they were invalidated in West Africa. But the main arrêté or document, postal document, is from 29th of October 1943, which had stated that certain effigies were no longer allowed and should not be used in French West Africa. And if they were, the letter should be non admis, non-admitted, and the letter sent to the dead letter box. And also people could turn in their inappropriate, invalidated stamps for new ones that were valid. Presumably, they never said specifically which stamps, which ones, but presumably these were the Pétain stamps. Pétain was no longer a person of great interest after the Free French took control of French West Africa in November 1943. And of course, he was not sort of persona non grata by de Gaulle and the Free French. So the stamps were invalidated. And in my experience, you just don't see any Vichy Pétain stamps in the post-war philatelic period at all. Outside of French West Africa, this is another interesting post-war philatelic curiosity. It's not true postal history, but this is French Indochina, Haiphong to New York. Registration back stamp is present from New York, showing the PEI-QI issue, as well as 3 of the airmail stamps of Indochina, including a high value $10 one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Vichy regime issued a lot of the typical Third Republic colonial stamps, but without RF, the only difference. And again, these 3 airmail stamps are typical of the regular airmails of the 1930s, except they're all without the RF. So these are all Vichy stamps that were inappropriately used, but accepted by the postmaster in Haiphong. Again, Indochina was a very strongly pro-Vichy colony, and one can only speculate that maybe there was more pro-Vichy sentiment after the war. Again, total speculation. Pétain stamps, actually, according to Jacques Desrousseaux, was a prominent Indochina philatelist who lived in Indochina during the war. He actually stated in some of these earlier articles that the Pétain stamps actually did reach Saigon in 1943, but it was a very small quantity and not enough to legitimately issue, and they were afraid of speculation. So the stamps were never issued. But then after the end of the war and the British blockade ended, then a large supply of Pétain stamps arrived in late 1945 and early 1946. Those again were not issued until June 1946, but only after Pétain was obliterated with a large RF overprint. And so that was so they actually did come into use in June, but Pétain was obliterated with RF. So that concludes the topic. Any questions? I'm probably over 20 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wasn't going to interrupt you. Any questions for Tom? We're going to have Richard talk to us too, so if you think of anything, save it for when Richard is done, and we'll turn to him now. And which one would you like to start with?
Well, how much time do we have left in the session?
Well, I don't know. People just kind of disappear. They don't.
Okay.
Well, we still got 25 people, so.
Well, okay. So we can. Well, let's just do the short one and then see the Vietnam Dong Chu Kung Hoa dual franking.
This one.
Yeah, that's
sorry. You can't see it. I can.
Oh, good for you.
Hold on. I want that one. How's that?
Okay. Ken's computer doesn't have the Vietnam font, so that's why you see some odd characters there.
Yep.
I wrote this some years ago and borrowing from Ed. Ed, you still there? Yeah. Ed has a presentation some years ago. What is a philatist to do? Next. So there is a considerable amount of research and documentation of the field post 411 that was in Hanoi in 1946. The Cochin China, the southern part of what's now Vietnam, was occupied by the Indians and the British to take the Japanese surrender. But the northern part, Tonkin and part of Annam, were given to the Chinese army to occupy and take the surrender. And that's the part of Vietnam that Ho Chi Minh in September 2nd, I think it was, 1945, declared independence. So this field post was not established until a negotiation between the French and the Ho Chi Minh government occurred, which recognized the, quote, independence, unquote, of Vietnam. Next, please. So here's the cover, and it is of significant interest to me, being an Indochina collector person. The field post 411 had a long, well, it's a long, short history. There was, at this time, French stamps had occurred and had arrived, and at the same time, the new government of Ho Chi Minh had overprinted existing Indochina stamps, which you can see on the left, and of course the French stamps are on the top. The situation was that the French government wanted to start postal service to allow the French civilians to correspond back home. So the real question here is, this is legitimately used. It's legitimately marked with both the Ho Chi Minh government cancels and the French cancels. The military post office was postally used, but the question is, why would anybody do this unless it was just done philatelically? And there is no answers. I surveyed quite a few philatelists in France to see if they could come up with any reasonable explanation, and there isn't one. This is the only cover that I know of and that I've been able to find that has the dual franking. And at that time, Vietnam was running the post office. There are actually four postal services in that part of Vietnam, the northern part of Vietnam. The Chinese army had one. The French military had one. The Vietnamese had one. I guess I said four, Arabian three. So there is a lot of confusion, and the documentation doesn't really exist well. But the interesting thing is both sets of stamps are the correct rate, postal rate, to France. So somebody had an idea that they were going to use the Vietnamese post office, I presume. It's quite inexplicable why somebody would do this, except for a philatelic purpose. But it's done, it's there, and this is the only one that I've ever seen from that military post office. Next. And it was, in fact, received in France appropriately through the French mails. Next. So the covers from this post office, which was in existence for about 6 months in Hanoi. It was originally only on a ship and then eventually went onto shore. Next. And there's a reasonable, uh, reasonable marking. What would be interesting you can see the French notation here. Stamps were attached, but they're mixed. So I'm not sure who was saying what to whom, but it must have appeared at the post office that way. Now, it possibly appeared at the post office that way, and some have made a notation. I'm open to suggestions. Next, and these are stamps, and here you see, as previously mentioned, the overprints of Vietnam Dong up to the et cetera. Let me see if I can remember my Vietnamese. Independence, freedom, and unification, I think it says. Sounds familiar. But the EF on the stamps, État Français, is, of course, overprinted with Vietnam. Next. So I wrote to some French philatelists and get various inputs, and we never have resolved this really, except it exists. It's there. It went through the mail, and it's very interesting. Now, if the Vietnam Post Office under Ho Chi Minh was servicing and providing mail services throughout Tonkin, the international aspect of that was probably very poor. We don't have much history. They could have accepted it, but informed that the Army Post Office, French Army Post Office, it would be fine. But again, it's all speculation. Next. So it's a proper postal rate, and everything is copacetic, and it went by air to France. Civil mail had to pay airmail surtax. Military mail would have gone free. So this is clearly from a civilian internee after the aforementioned March 7th of overthrow of the Vichy government. Next. And this extracts from the March 6th, 1946 agreement between the Ho Chi Minh government and the French government, specifically that, yes, we agree that the Vietnamese government is independent and it's self-governing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this led to the first Indochina War. Of significant interest here politically is the mention of Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. Tonkin and Annam were technically protectorates, where Cochin China was a possession. And in order for the three areas to merge, there had to be action by the French legislature to basically give up the possession of Cochin China, Saigon, and surrounds. And of course, if you have all the good words that the Vietnamese government would accept the French, yada. Now, of interest in 1946 is when the first Indochina War really started, December 46. So this was in March. So there's only really a 9-month interim between the French arriving and really starting the Civil War. Next. And this was all of the additional details. with the, and you see now, you see the indication here of the 16th parallel. I'm not going to reread the words, but remember the Chinese were there too.
Richard, we both have the recording that people can watch, and we will put a PDF of the slides on the website also, so you can read this at your leisure.
Right. So this is just for information. Next, please. And then this is where I found it. I did buy it, purchase it, as you will. Next, please. These, I was mentioning December 46th, wasn't I? These covers, and I referred this to Krista Gartner. These covers, which you see occasionally, they're all dated the 18th of December of 46, with the Vietnamese postmark cancels and various stamps on, none of which the rates really make no sense. Various overprints and hand stamps and on and on and on. In the 18th of December 46 is when the official date of the first Indochina War, where the Viet Minh of Ho Chi Minh tried to take control of Hanoi and Haiphong, and the French had to battle for a couple of days to get control back again. So these are from the looted post offices, and they're attractive in that they represent a turning point of history. Next. And this one says it went through the mail, but I don't believe it. It's possible. Next. So this is what Frank said. I don't know if you know of these pieces. It's a made-up cover from the looted post office. Next. This is more documentation, December 19th. Now, you really have to think about this for a minute. Who is of a philatelic mind to go into a looted post office and rummage around through the drawers in the safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I lived there in Vietnam for 3-4 years and during the war, and the last thing I would have done is try to go into the main Saigon post office and dig through the rubble. It kind of boggles my mind what people were thinking to make philatelic mail and to issue it on the market. Next.
That's it.
That's it. So I had to say, now the other one's much longer. So depending upon how much patience we have.
I suspect we should save that for another day. We're already past 4 o'clock.
I think that's a good idea. That's why I picked the short one.
Yeah.
Questions, anybody? I would like to see other covers like this if anybody has them. But I've never found one with the dual franking. I mean,
if you have a question, remember to unmute yourself.
And on the SICP website, there is a nice presentation done by Ron Bentley on the details and various examples of that French military post office in Hanoi 411. That's all I had.
Super.
Good day.
Well, thank you, Richard. That was very much worth waiting from November until now, as was Tom's.
Well, everything ages, as we all know, right?
Yes. Yes. Good deal. All right. Any last call for questions? Then I am going to stop the recording.